Team Human is ad-free and supported by people like you. I want to give a special thanks to some of our Team Human members, Morgan Barnard, Deanie Wallace, Adam Yasmin, K.O. Sweaver, and Caleb Madden. Thanks for being on Team Human. If you become a supporting member by going to teamhuman.fm and clicking on support, you'll get access to our Discord, where we do our Team Human salons and have all sorts of fun discussions. You'll also get access to the Rushkoff archives and old interviews with people like Leary and McKenna, and have all sorts of fun being a supporting member of the team. You're on Team Human, conscious intervention in the machine, your respite from the fear and loathing, your safe space to think dangerous thoughts and say dangerous things, a chance to reconnect your mind with your heart and your body with your soul. Yes, you're on Team Human, and there's nothing you can do about it. Playing for Team Human today, journalist and author of books including Kids These Days, Shit is Fucked Up and Bullshit, and the just-released global history of Silicon Valley, Palo Alto, a history of California, capitalism, and the world. Malcom Harris.
We're moving towards some real limits, not just economically, but ecologically. And that has to do with these things getting sillier, or the things getting sillier has to do with that, right?
Malcom is going to help us understand the history and foundations of the Silicon Valley mindset so we can better respond to its destructive capacity today. It's time to intervene on behalf of people. I'm Douglas Rushkoff, and we're all on Team Human. I'm glad you're here today. It's kind of a special Team Human. Malcom Harris wrote a piece about me last month in Wired, and it was really moving and important to me to kind of see a journalist of this rigor kind of look at where I've come from and what I'm trying to do and where I'm going, and kind of to treat the journey I've been on with not respect, but with clear eyes. You know, he really got what it is I'm trying to do. And it meant a lot to me, especially coming from him. I've been following his work for quite a while. So I'm really psyched to be able to introduce him and his work to you. Hopefully I can do even half as much justice as he did to my work. But before that, finally, I'm going to get to finish sharing with you these 4 interventions I've been working on, my 4 interventions to help, save the world, I guess. I've done these, I did these kind of, this is the 5th monologue, I guess, dedicated to this. It's 5 pieces about what I've been calling changing the register, which really just means engendering the attitudes and behaviors that we want to see in ourselves by intervening in the cultural landscape instead of manipulating people. So instead of some techno-solutionist manipulation of the world, we just kind of try to engender things by changing the landscape. And the first 3 interventions, you can listen to them in previous weeks, they were to denaturalize power, trigger agency, and re-socialize people. And I think I saved the best one for last. And it's really awe, how to cultivate awe. And it's because our experiences of collectivity, what we get when we get re-socialized, they engender a state of awe. This is what people are after when they attend a festival, a rave, a concert, or even a museum or a natural wonder. It's not just a fleeting high that we get, although we get that, but we also get an experience of the dissolution of self and a sense of connection to everything else. It's awesome and real, and it's also pro-social and capable of helping us mobilize to achieve a collective eudaimonia. It's an ideal from Aristotelian thought that venerates the liberated condition of universal flourishing. So, as scientists are currently learning, an experience of awe makes a person more generous while also regulating cytokines for a more balanced immune response. Cultivating awe means creating opportunities for people to shift from the short-lived pleasure of an online hit, just that dopamine hit, to the longer-term social openness of true connection, or the oxytocin hit. Awe means experiencing oneself as part of something greater. To the current individualist mindset, that kind of connection sounds frightening. It seems like a diminishment of one's individuality and freedom. Awe and intimacy and group consciousness, they seem to compromise self-sovereignty and claims to ownership. How do you defend your IP if you're connected to everyone and everything else? When in actuality, awe opens us to the fuller realization that our individual and collective identities are mutually reinforcing. Instead of embracing awe, however, the frightened individual just panics. We build walls instead of tearing them down. I discussed the difference between panic and awe at length in my book Present Shock, and I tried to show how digital technologies, they tend to collapse narrative, and I suggested how this could lead vulnerable people toward really paranoid and conspiratorial substitutes for the linear story. And we've seen that sad possibility play out even worse than I feared. Instead of doubling down on the extractive and distracting technologies that substitute for awe with shots of adrenaline, we can employ styles of education and arts that engender more of an embrace of the moment. Through experiences of awe, we build tolerance for a sustainable present. It may also mean breaking free of the styles of narrative on which we've become to depend, really. Stories with beginnings and middles and endings, a crisis, climax, and sleep. They train us to see that heightened state of awareness as unsustainable. And worse, they train us to believe that an ending is desirable. The hero is either victorious or vanquished, but at least the story ends and we get to know who won. Instead, if we dispense with finite games for infinite ones and embrace awe as a steady state possibility, then we can create theater and film, TV, research, and education that promotes the collective dynamic over individual assessment and achievement. We encourage the creation of art and culture that is recalibrating, and technology that's non-abrasive to the nervous system, stuff that engenders awe. We stop using technology on people in an effort to program them and instead provide the tools, sensibilities, socialization, and courage we need to program the world ourselves together. That's the register I'm aiming for. Not a new ledger through which to do our accounting, but a new register in which to sing the human song together. My friend and comrade Malcolm Harris has been studying a very different register for the past decade or so and produced a book, Palo Alto, A History of California, Capitalism, and the World, that filled in a lot of the gaps in my own understanding of the story of how Silicon Valley came to be, while also crystallizing aspects of the tech mindset I've been studying myself since the early 90s. Malcolm is an author's author, a guy who does the rigorous analysis that's actually required of us, particularly when telling a story this epic and relevant to the human condition. I hope you get as much out of this encounter as I did. The beauty of your book is that being as thorough as it is, we could pretty much talk about anything, and it has a touch point to your book. So let's just talk. And this could just be a sign of my own age or stage of life or something. But I'm right now most interested in the dedication. I'm interested in your dad. Like, what was your dad like? And as you wrote, like, to my father, what kind of, was there something specific you were thinking that in the way he intersected with the journey that you've been on these years?
Yeah, so the book is dedicated to my father. He's definitely still with us. In fact, he's
great.
In his late 50s. He's a relatively young guy.
Yeah.
Also a child of California, grew up in the Bay Area, which is sort of how I ended back there. So insofar as, we're part of the same historical project of California settlement, that like trying to understand my history is also trying to understand his history. And so it's for him in that way. He helped me a lot with the project, especially with the fact checking. He caught things that like no one else would have caught because he grew up as a hacker in the Bay Area, in the 80s. I called National Semiconductor National to be for short, and he said,
Right.
we would never call it that. We'd call it would be National Semi, or
Right.
stuff like that.
Like a Broadway show. It's like,
old hacker terms
right.
and stuff.
Yeah. Like whether you have those shorter things, like if someone called, like, instead of saying Les Mis, they said, we saw Rob Lace. And you go, we were.
No. Yeah. That's not how you say it. So like, and getting some of that stuff wrong wouldn't have been the end of the world,
right.
But like, it definitely makes a huge difference, I think, at the end of the day.
For the authenticity to people who were around for it too. I mean, because everything that I was exposed to, and I only really know about maybe 40 pages or 50 pages, in the last third. It's like, that's the part that I saw.
Yeah, I come in. Yeah, right.
And it was like, that's pretty much what we saw, what happened there. And to see those names and stuff. But was your dad was a hacker, or did he go to work for the companies as a hacker?
No, he was like a, teen hacker, because he's born in 1965. So
he would have been the prime age for like phone phreaking and
yeah, exactly. Phone phreaking, dumpster diving for codes and stuff, like the movies Hacker.
Was he a raver?
No. It's because by the time he got married at 19.
Wow.
He met my mom at 19, got married at 21. And then had me by 24.
Right. That's how he can have an adult child in his 50s. Yeah.
Yeah, 3 of them, in fact. He's
wow. Prolific.
I'm the eldest.
Oh my gosh. Well, good for you. And congratulations on this.
Yeah, so it was sort of a tribute to that, to his thing. And he's like in the book a little bit if you know where to look, because then he was an IP attorney who did a bunch of like anti-Microsoft and trademark cases. So like when I talk about deep linking and the court case over deep linking and like would deep linking be allowed on the web, like that was his case. He was the attorney in that. So like I watched that case from my childhood, watching it like from the front row or whatever. So he's in that story a lot as well. So yeah, I figure, mid-30s now I can like at the place where I can dedicate a book to my father. And
I know. It's nice. It's nice. I remember when I dedicated my book, Media Virus, I said to my parents for letting me watch as much TV as I wanted.
There you go. Exactly.
We're not restricting, because it worked out. It worked out to everyone's benefit. But when I first found out about you, I know you did a book, but before you did this book, you wrote a big piece. I think it was in the New Inquiry about student debt.
At N+1, actually.
Oh, N+1. Right. And it was like, what struck me about it wasn't just that, oh my gosh, look at the student debt problem, but you were doing the thing that I've tried to do, which is like report on something that's like super obvious and there, but no one sees it. Do you know what I mean? It's like
that's what we all shoot for. I mean, like I got really lucky with that one in that way. But yeah, I think that is like all cultural, economic, political commentators look for. Like they want to hit that thing that everyone knows about, but that no one has like the right critical angle on.
Right. Or people haven't articulated. It's like been at the tip of everybody's tongue and not an unarticulated common problem. And you put a name to it and you go, oh no, you're not the only one with student debt. This is like a big thing. And it's actually like this giant institutionalized problem. It's
Well, and that's what's so crazy is at the time people forget. I mean, or people may not even know, because now we're like 12 years past, right? This was like 2011. Speaking of being old, is that people thought student debt was good. You should like pile on as much student debt as you possibly can, because it can only suggest that you got better education, and then that education is going to turn into job satisfaction, wages, etc. And no one had suggested that maybe there was something bad about it. Was like not a mainstream thing that people were saying, that like maybe people having an average of $30,000 in student debt is not a good thing.
right. Or $300,000 debt, which as the case may be today.
Yeah, well, I mean, the average when I was writing then was I remember like close to hitting 30. The total outstanding was close to hitting 1 trillion, I think. I'm trying to, no, it was only 800 billion at the time, and it's grown so much just since then. It's pretty incredible. And we're at this very strange stalemate with it. But that piece really came out of like my political work in college around tuition and student debt and the financial crisis.
Right. And it was right around the Occupy time too, which is like the financial crisis happened and everyone said, oh, all these people who got these loans and were hoping for real estate to go up just so that they could refinance their houses at a better rate and own more of it. I mean, it was an insane system that they had for people to stay in their places. It was like, oh, well, that one crashed. What's next? And it was like the student loan. And it still hasn't happened, though. It hasn't broke.
No. Well, we've had an interesting couple of years where the pandemic allowed for the suspension of student loan payments, and then Biden tried to do a forgiveness, and that stalled. But that suspension of payments has been a workable stasis for both sides, it seems like, at this moment. But I have a hard time believing they're just gonna turn the knob back on and they're gonna resume payments the way it used to be. I just don't think there's the political will for that.
Right. Or to turn it off completely either, though. I think you're right. It's going to be like North Korea, South Korea, just some demilitarized economic zone,
Yeah, well, and I think that's the shape of a lot of our problems right now, and how they're trying to address them, or the inability of our political system to address a lot of our large social problems at the moment.
So anyway, to this magnum opus of a book you did, which is to me, it's almost like a Graeber kind of scaled, David Graeber scaled, look at something you wouldn't realize is such a big story until you look at Palo Alto and go, oh, right. Because everyone has a touch point with it. Like for me, it's Institute for the Future and a meeting I had at Stanford once, or a bookstore here, and some Wozniak friend over there. But then when you see it all laid out and going as far back as, I'm sure everyone wants to talk to you about the Stanford method and for raising horses, which is almost a kind of central metaphor for the book. It's kind of shocking, but yeah, many of us had seen California as the end of colonialism. And then they basically had to invent new territories to expand to, whether they're, economic or virtual or cerebral, because they saw, they got to the cliff. There's nowhere else. And there's China over there. And that's kind of where it started. What do we do now? So they invented all these things, even down south, with Hollywood and all. But to start with the Stanford method, I guess maybe you should explain the Stanford method as it applied to cults.
Yeah. The Palo Alto system as designed by Leland Stanford and Charles Marvin, which was when Leland Stanford has to flee class conflict in San Francisco with his family and start this suburb, which he founds, called Palo Alto. The thing that he sets up in this place is the largest trotting horse breeding and training facility in the land. And this is an ancient technology, of course, horses dragging stuff, but it was still, at the end of the 19th century, the most important technology in North America. Horses dragged boats through canals, they dragged streetcars through the cities, they dragged agricultural implements through the fields, they dragged artillery through battlefields. Horses were the engines of the country. And so Leland Stanford, as this, avatar of capital in the West and the first disruptor of Palo Alto, says, I'm going to reinvent the horse breeding and training process. And we're going to call this the Palo Alto system. And we're going to shorten the production cycle for these super fast, super capable horses. And the way we're going to do that, we're going to draw inspiration from Germany. And Germany is at the time developing young children's education. They're developing education in general as a, state institution, something that the state has an investment in producing, the educated laborers of the future. And they're starting with young children with this new institution that they call the kindergarten. And so there are no kindergartens west of the Rockies in the United States at this point. But Leland Stanford decides he's going to build one for horses. And so he builds in Palo Alto the first kindergarten in the West, which is a shrunk down training track for horses, for colts. And the wisdom had been that you don't train young horses, young yearlings, to run as fast as they can, because the odds are too great that you're going to snap a leg or snap a tendon and waste your perfectly good horses.
Right.
But Leland Stanford says, I'm doing this at such a large scale that I can afford to waste those horses in the interest of finding the fastest, youngest ones really early so that we can speed up this production process. And they are able, he and the lead trainer, Charles Marvin, are able to do this successfully. And they're able to create very quickly the fastest, youngest horses in the world. And everyone has to, salute this Palo Alto system for raising and training horses. Now, of course, very quickly after that, the steam engine and then gasoline replace the horse as the fuel and engine of the country. So the Palo Alto system sort of gets buried in history, and it's really Muybridge and the moving pictures that come to stand for the technical advancements of the Palo Alto stock farm. That motion pictures also come out of this same period, and Muybridge is really good at branding, and so he gets most of the sort of credit, historical memory around this process. But the Palo Alto system and those intangible values that underlie it about speed and scale and youth and disruption and capitalist production, applying capitalist logic to new areas increasingly.
And eugenics even?
Eugenics, absolutely. Yeah, right. The assumption that the adult is always implicitly present in the child and that you can tell what the fastest horses will be based on the fastest yearlings, which is not exactly true. It doesn't really work like that. But it's a lot easier to reproduce the genetics than it is to reproduce the really expensive training. And so that's a good marketing position. And so those values, that set of values, I think still is totally present in the area. And if you go to Sand Hill Road and say, what's the Palo Alto? You, sir, what is the Palo Alto system? They won't know. They don't know this story about the stock farm unless they read my excerpt in the Atlantic.
Right.
But if you say okay, but if you had to guess what the Palo Alto system is, or if they tried to make something up, which they, odds are they might do, it's Palo Alto. I think they would probably say something similar. Or if you described the system, they would say oh yeah, that's what we do here in Palo Alto.
Right. I mean, that's the whole premise of the incubator, right? You pull some kid out of college when they're a freshman, 19 years old, because they have some baby idea, right? But you're going to take 100 of them because 2 of these ideas are going to work, and you basically ruined 98 careers. It's the same as shooting up a racehorse that's, snapped his ankle.
Yeah, and they said as much and they knew as much, and it's kind of chilling to read as a young person who grew up in that area, to read this sort of them saying, yeah, you waste some good ones. It's true, you do waste some good ones, but, overall, statistically, this is an advantageous way to do it. And then that's creepy.
It is creepy, but it's creepy also then how, so on the one hand, so you get, it ruins Silicon Valley, it ruins the businesses, you end up with all these children CEO founders of companies who do the kinds of things that we see these adult children tech bros doing that we both kind of despise. But it also instills us all with this, as a parent, with the kind of the baby Einstein model of child rearing. It's there too. I've got to get the special child Netflix genius making channel. So they're looking at these special shapes that were trained to, make their brains grow specially.
Yeah, well, and a lot of that stuff develops organically out of Stanford, out of the Bay Area, right? Stanford decides, especially like really relatively early, to devote attention to the not just education as a practice, but education as theory, and developing theories of education and eugenic theories of education from the very, very beginning. And so Cubberley, who's the first head of the education department at Stanford, is himself a eugenicist, from the beginning. Lewis Terman, who is the one who redevelops the IQ test into a general purpose IQ test and does the California Genius Search, where he's interviewing and testing children from all around the state and then tracking their advancement to draw conclusions about educational practice. He's a eugenicist, from the same set of institutions, from Indiana University as well as Cubberley. So, and this stuff is pretty clearly into today, right? So then you look at Suppies, who's a student of Terman's, and then he's developing the educational tech programs that I used when I was teaching kids at SCORE Tutoring Center on Middlefield Road in Palo Alto.
Yeah, I was doing Princeton Review,
Yeah, it's like 2-3 steps.
Right. But then the nightmare of it, though, that I can understand using techniques like this if we're at war. Okay, so we got desperate times call for desperate measures. Let's get our babies learning things.
But we are at war.
Right.
And that's the thing, is that Palo Alto has always understood itself to be confronting a hostile world that wants to remove its privileges, right? And if someone wants to take your privileges, if someone wants to take the legacy you're leaving for your child, that's war, right? That's war on you. If someone wants to move into your neighborhood and reduce the value of your, seat at the local school, that's war. That's war on your family, and you need to find a way to preserve the 19th century privileges of settlement into the 21st century. And that's hard. You also have to suppress that understanding of what it is you're doing and make it into just you're trying your best and you're just trying to
because you got to be liberal or something in there, or at least Ayn Randian, you're being true to your inner self by not caring about the other. But there's two different wars we're talking about here. I mean, one is, the war on people of color or Mexicans or poor people or whoever's in the mission and yelling at you or throwing rocks at your commuter bus. But then there was the real war, right? You said somewhere in there when you were talking about HP, and I didn't know the history of Hewlett Packard. You were saying something, there was nothing more genuinely Stanford tech than Hewlett Packard, and then looking at all these kind of military connections and HP is there because of the Shah of Iran. And I was looking, so you recount sort of our US Fed revolution of Iran and our placement of the Shah, and just maybe 2 or 3 pages from where you start talking about what we did in Nicaragua, and Stanford and HP, they're involved in all these things. And all I'm thinking as I'm reading it is, oh my God, there's a reason why all these people really hate us, right? It's not just that they hate our way of life. They hate what we did to these countries. I mean, that you create a really clear explanation of why there's all these people from war-torn and impoverished places in Central America walking up to try to get to safety in America. And it's because of stuff that we did down there, the destabilization that we did. They're not intrinsically destabilized.
Yeah, well, and I think, Southeast Asia and Vietnam is such a great example because it's so direct, where you have, David Packard is Deputy Secretary of Defense under Nixon. He is conducting the Vietnam War.
Partly, right, that's Hewlett Packard.
Yeah, David Packard of Hewlett Packard. And
it's again, saying Wozniak, you know what I mean? It's it's...
and people then knew, associated it. When I was growing up in Palo Alto, though, Packard and the David and Lucille Packard Foundation stood for philanthropy, straight up, in the area. The Jobs Foundation wasn't nearly as big at the time. It was the Packard Foundation funded everything. It was East Palo Alto charity, whatever charity, anything. That's what you associated the Packard name with. But you go back into the 60s, 70s, and Packard was the villain. You know, they chased him around the Bay Area. The left did. The anti-war movement chased him and also firebombed Bill Hewlett's house. And they understood these people as war profiteers and as war contractors and as war criminals. They chanted Packard before Calley, referencing Lieutenant Calley, who was the most infamous war criminal of the Vietnam era, talking about, we're going to get Packard before Calley. You know, they tried to effectuate a people's arrest of David Packard, and he flees the South Bay, and the militant left issues this proclamation saying, like, David Packard is too scared. He can't even, like, stand in the city he owns. And so that's how they were thinking of, like, tech at the time. And that was a sophisticated understanding, because as a result of this defeat of America in the Vietnam War, there are tens of thousands of refugees, and Hewlett Packard adds thousands of Vietnamese refugees onto its factory lines in the South Bay. That they, more than any other company, benefits from this new labor source of immigrants. And so to watch that cycle, you know, they're using Hewlett Packard parts to build the bombs that they drop on South Asia, directed by the founder of the company, and then gather those workers, the refugees. And if they had won the war, you know that there would have been HP factories and contracting factories located in low-wage capitalist Vietnam. Right. And so this is like as direct a picture as you can possibly get of imperialism. But we don't associate Silicon Valley with it in that way. But at the time, they really did. And so you can really see what kind of PR war Silicon Valley won since then.
It did, though, because I was a kid. I was in high school in 1979 when the Altair came out. Mm-hmm. And the Altair seemed, and this is just their beautiful illusion, it seemed as if it was born ex nihilo, kind of from a fledgling hippie counterculture, slightly on. I mean, there are a few libertarians in the mix, maybe there in the background, but it was just dudes finding stuff and shoving it in a metal box, and here we go. Let's play, as if, you know what I mean? It seemed to kids then anyway that that's when it was born, that this whole other Iran and war and history of this stuff didn't exist.
Yeah, this was the personal revolution, right? And so instead of having to interact with like large social structures to access computing power for the first time, it was something that you could like hold and have in your bedroom, which represented something different. But it also represented something different to the military and the intelligence systems, which could do the same thing. And so the same technology that allowed you to have a computer in your bedroom for the first time allows Oliver North to run a secret government with 10 guys and a set of laptops.
Right.
And that history is like much less well told because it reflects less well on the industry. But it's like, that's a Park spinoff, is that produces the laptop that the intelligence services uses. It comes from the exact same place.
Exactly. Or even, I mean, there's a guy, I think you mentioned them in passing, or there's a guy named Ed Vigory, who was originally the direct mail head of the Republican Party. And he gets a few laptops, and all of a sudden, out of a Republican Party, out of a garden apartment in California, has most of America, and able to do direct mailing, basically able to target direct mailing to individual households based on what they know about them from collecting Axiom and Claritas and other data.
Well, and it allows for the birth of a layer of independent contracting businesses that large firms are then able to outsource functions to and undermine their mid-century legacy labor agreements, which is really what Apple is birthed doing, right? Like that's why Xerox, and I tell the story in the book, is that's why Xerox invests in Apple in the first place. That's why Xerox does this technology transfer from Xerox PARC to Apple, is not because they think Steve Jobs is such a cool guy and they want to be his friend. Like he was an asshole. What Apple was really good at was manufacturing computers cheaply. And the way they did that is by sticking them in a bunch of, immigrant kitchens to get wired not through their contracts with manufacturing unions.
I know. The thing you picture with Apple is like, oh, there were these like nerd dude, California pot smoking nerd dudes in the basement, maybe, but assembling these things with soldering irons and signing their names on the inside of the original computer. They had like their names on there. And to read that, oh no, what gave Apple its advantage was the extent to which they could essentially outsource the labor to the poorest of poor immigrants.
Yeah, I went into like a network of Filipina housewives in the Bay Area at that time. And the Bay Area has always maintained networks of technically capable, underpaid piece workers at this time. And so like that image sort of comes more from Atari, which really was the like early, and that's where like Wozniak gets started.
Right. Jobs worked there too, right?
Well, Jobs works there, and he yes, he famously got Wozniak to program Breakout and told him the wrong dollar amount and sort of stole from him.
Right, he embezzled Woz's programming fee.
Right.
And then Woz starts a company with him. I mean, it's like, fool me once, shame on me, right?
Yeah, he made it happen. He made things happen. And the Atari production lines were like, they had like sexy chicks, and they were doing drugs and like having a bunch of fun, the soldering irons and stuff, like young white people having a blast in the tech industry. And that was the Atari lines. That situation is a product of like anti-unionization and like labor struggle at the same time, because like Atari had started outsourcing their factories in the early 60s. It wasn't like in the 80s that they start outsourcing. Is that there's a union drive at the 3 Atari factories in the early 60s, and they just outsource 2 of them, and the union drive fails. And they continue. Yeah. And so like when in the official business history of Silicon Valley, when you're reading about the like, oh, the Atari production and like these tech kids making stuff on the assembly line and having fun and flirting and
right. Yeah, it was WeWork 1979 or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. But like that is already an outcome of the official labor movement being crushed in these places, and like is not told as part of that foundational official story. If you read the official histories of the Bay Area, official histories of the tech industry, they just don't talk about, they talk about who wires the first one, and then don't bother talking about who wires all the rest of them. And I got to give Michael Malone credit for his like contemporaneous accounts where he really makes sure to include that history. And I think it's interesting that it falls out of some of the like almost all of the retrospective accounts.
Yeah, well, just like the tent village outside Facebook's headquarters today, or outside Stanford even right now. I mean, those are the things on the margins that we try not to look at, whatever we call that, externalities. But there's this moment of possibility, and I guess that's because I came up in it. I always see it as dominant, but turns out it was like Jerry Garcia describes the 60s. He said, it happened in like over a period of 2 weeks in 1968. Exactly. That was the 60s. But this moment of hobbyists and shareware and Eudora and Mosaic, and we were on the back of the bus going to school. We'd share wares on 5 1/4-inch floppies, and it seemed like we were going to be, we kids, we hackers, we Matthew Broderick or whoever it was. And, there was this moment of possibility with, even though, and I know there was sort of conflict between the visionary nerds and the real tech developers, that would work itself out. But we were going to have the power with our cassette deck and our Tandy thing or our Commodore, and it just seemed like this cyberpunk, kid-driven, psychedelic, fractal rave thing was going to happen. And then Bill Gates wrote this letter that I've still always been confused about. I mean, I always talk about John Barlow's Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace as the turning point, but I'm thinking that's not really it. That it's this letter that Bill Gates wrote. And I'm interested to know from you, well, first, what was this letter? Why did it work? And what would have happened if he didn't write it? Would someone...
Yeah, so the letter to hobbyists was famously Bill Gates's letter to the computer community, published openly. I can't remember what the publication was that published it. There were a few, computer hobbyist publications at the time, saying stop ripping off my operating system that he had bought the rights to. He hadn't written it himself. It's important to know, whatever, because people were already passing around the code to BASIC, and people had been passing around codes to operating systems forever. And so when he was deploying the new operating system and had been hired to do it, his little company, Micro Software or whatever, Microsoft, had been selected to have the first microcomputer operating system. And people didn't want to wait for it to come out, and they didn't want to pay for the extortionate price that they're charging for it. And so someone made a copy, and they'd been passing around the paper tape, and he wrote this letter asserting an intellectual property right to the operating system and saying, like, if you're going to do it this way, then this is never going to work. We can't share. It's not sharing, it's stealing. It's the same rhetoric as you wouldn't share a baby, or whatever. You wouldn't steal a car. Like, well, why would you steal software? Like, software costs money to develop, et cetera, et cetera. Now, of course, Bill Gates inherits his position in life from his banker mother and attorney father, and it's not like he had again invented the thing himself. He had ended up being in a place to license it, sort of in the same way that Steve Jobs had licensed his buddy Wozniak's programming for Breakout and then made more money with it. They were clever business guys, and they were asserting the value of their own business cleverness to this industry.
But there is a logic to that. I mean, someone spent hours making that, the same as, Taylor Swift spends hours writing her song. I can see why she doesn't want, people just to steal it.
Sure. Or, those of us who write books or whatever, let's say.
Right.
But again, Bill Gates didn't write the operating system, which is important to remember. So that's the difference, is he wasn't saying, it wasn't a claim about, I did this so I should get paid. It was the importance of intellectual property ownership by capital into the future, is that unless you were willing to respect that title, no one could get rich. It's not that no one could get paid, because people continued to get paid off shareware into the 90s, right? Like writing software and giving it away or charging people for the disk or whatever continued to be a way to make money, but it was not a way to get rich. And the way to get rich was to have this proprietary license to intellectual property that someone would have to pay you every time they were using. And that's how Bill Gates got rich, is because every time then a PC maker ended up making a PC, they were paying his company a license fee for their operating system. And he was pretty smart about how he structured those payments so that they would pay for every CPU they produced, not for the ones that actually use the operating system. And so at that point, you might as well use the operating system for every CPU that you produced. And so it became very quickly the dominant operating system, and this real monopoly position, as the manufacturers themselves were deciding what kind of operating system would run on their machines. And so as they became more of a consumer object as opposed to a hobbyist project, what operating system you wanted to run on your machine mattered less than which one the manufacturer had installed and which one that software writers were writing their software to work on and to be compatible with. And then this is what gives Microsoft then the monopoly in the computer software space, the operating system space, which again, my dad would be very careful to say that, it's the personal computer operating system, that if you look at server operating systems, a lot of those are still open source, right? It's not, they didn't get privatized in the same way because the commercial incentives function differently. And it's not like therefore the server space is democratic or didn't make people rich or whatever, but it functioned a little differently.
Right. My impulse is to say it's better, if it's open source and Apache or whatever they're using, that it's...
Yeah, but, and in some ways, I guess, but in some ways, it doesn't really matter.
Right. I mean, and then as you start thinking about it, it's almost as if Silicon Valley was less about pure hacking than really just hacking capitalism. They saw that operating system and certainly didn't challenge it, but figured out how do we with tech take over from, I mean, you kind of talk about it, that it used to be that there was like the whatever blonde, wonderful Rhodes Scholar athlete, athlete, academic, superboy with great genes would get kind of chosen and become the head of the banking system or whatever. And now there's this different class of kind of smelly, nerdy people using technology to hack that economic system in order to make themselves rich.
Yeah, well, and that was the change in what the American project required from these guys, So David Packard, again, is the great example of the first kind of guy you were talking about, where he's 6'5". He's a, standout athlete, very popular, very handsome. And like the Stanford administrators basically, as soon as they see him, they decide that's the guy. We're putting on chips on him and help him start his company and really support him from the beginning. And it's actually David Packard who has to say, no, you really want Bill Hewlett. Like this guy, this is the best engineer in our class. Like, and because he wasn't as tall or athletic as doesn't attract them in the same way, because that wasn't exactly what they were looking for. But they were dependent on that selection by public officials, by military officials, by academic officials, provosts, etc., to pick you and make you the guy who starts the company. But with the generation of the nerds, the switch to Steve Jobs and Bill Gates of the world, their credentials come from somewhere very different. And they learn to use computers mostly, instead of on public machines, on private machines that they get access to. They drop out of college. They don't join the military. They start their own companies, with their family money, perhaps, or with money they're able to wheedle out of friends and acquaintances from their actual personal networks, as opposed to through institutional networks like the state or like their university.
I know. So they always talk about your friends and family round.
Yeah, right.
It's like, who are your friends and family, man?
Well, and that's the question. And so you see this switch, and not even just in the United States or even in Palo Alto, but around the world, a reversion to the privileges of family. There's a great book by Melinda Cooper called Family Values that has this account, and it sort of flips the idea of neoliberalism on its head, where you think that in the neoliberal age is characterized by like individualism and your like separation from larger systems and structures and the disintegration of the family. But what she argues, I think very persuasively, and something that affected my analysis, but was also confirmed with the history that I've looked through, is that in the neoliberal era, it's family relations and family privilege that assume this increased importance, that like where you're born becomes again important in a way that it wasn't in the mid-century, where the way I talk about it is Rooseveltism shuffling the national deck of white men, right? So you have like privileges of place, privileges of class sort of shuffled a little bit. So you could come from anywhere in the 40s, 30s, 40s, and by the 60s be a big business guy if you were a white man. It's still like, limited range of opportunity, but it was significantly expanded. And then, in the next period, you have a reversion to the continuation of family privilege in a way that wasn't there before. And that is a reversion.
Right. And the same old, use of immigrant labor, when you talk about Apple, that their success was basically, get people to work harder than they should, either because they're essentially enslaved, sweatshop workers, or because they're in a cult of personality and you somehow motivate them to do that, or Amazon doing it when they with now documented, piss bottles around their warehouses.
Well, and that people understood that. People from Silicon Valley knew that. So like I grew up hearing stories about the Wozniaks and about Jobs, and Steve Wozniak was the one who built things and Steve Jobs was the one who yelled at everybody to work faster. And that's what I grew up hearing from like very, very, very young. It's like, don't, whatever you hear from, Palo Alto propaganda or whatever, always keep in mind, Wozniak built things, Jobs told people to work faster. And it's very funny watching this is like a pre-iPod, resurrection of Steve Jobs' brand knowledge.
Right.
And so then when he comes back and becomes this avatar of 21st century capital or whatever, I had still always known him as the guy who yelled at people to work faster. And that's really who he was. And if you talk to people in the Bay Area who knew him or were closer to his actual work, as opposed to the aura or the like wealth or the brand, they remember who Steve Jobs is. And Steve Jobs was a character of the 80s.
Right. But then also true to the, Palo Alto method. You snap a few tendons, there's a few teen suicides because of your social media, a few, Chinese laborers jumping out of windows. That's sort of kind of the cost of doing business in this way.
And that's what Steve Jobs personally said about the suicides in the Foxconn factories is like, well, it's not that high. Like the rate isn't that high. Sometimes people kill themselves. There are a lot of people who work there.
Right.
What you gonna
These
do?
are few and far between. Exactly. A few people are going to kill themselves anyway. Yeah. There you have it.
Which of course you would never say. And I got like sort of yelled at. Well, people have been very critical of me of juxtaposing that line with the suicides of children in Palo Alto, as if they would have a separate logic for their own children than they would for other children. And that's not true. It's a structural logic. Like, I know you might love your own children more than you love the 19-year-olds who are putting together iPhones or whatever, but your structural relation to them is going to be the same, right? It's still going to be this Palo Alto system where it's like, well, if we want the largest productivity out of the aggregate, that means we got to burn people out.
Right. On either end, right? It's like,
absolutely.
It's just like when you look at the carbon footprint of a Tesla or something, there's the before and the after, it's you're not going to say, well, one is more important than the other, which, well, we do though. Of course, it's little white Silicon Valley lives matter more than Chinese factory lives, right? In the eugenics of the model.
Yeah, well, but in theory, and then you juxtapose the suicides and realizing these are the same age kids killing themselves on literally the same days, and they hadn't appeared connected to me at the time. But looking back now and trying to understand both phenomena at the same time, it's impossible for me not to see them as connected.
And there was a moment when I was thinking, well, maybe these tech bros are not innocent, but they're victimized by a system that they can't see their way out of. You have this the quote, I guess it's a famous quote from Travis Kalanick, but I had forgotten about it, about why he had to take so much investment money. And he said, it's not my preference, but it's required when the money is available. And it's really interesting because I remember when I saw Evan Williams, one of the founders of Twitter, on the cover of the Wall Street Journal. And when they had their IPO, they put each of the founders there with the number of billions they had made that day under their face. And it was like 4.3 billion was right under his face. And I remember thinking, oh, this poor guy is screwed, right? How is he going to make 100x or 1,000x that with this 140 character messaging app? And of course he couldn't. They couldn't. It's impossible. But then when I see that Travis is saying, or Kalanick, this is the guy who started Uber, it's not his preference, that it's required when the money is available. I guess because what? Because if he didn't take it, then someone else will take it and then have a bigger war chest?
Yeah, well, and if the Saudis come to you and say, we want to put $5 billion into Uber, and your answer can't be, oh, no, we can't scale that fast, because then they'll go to Lyft and say, okay, fine, we want to put $5 billion on Lyft. And if they say, okay, we'll take it, we will scale that fast, then they'll wipe you out. And so you got to keep up this arms race. And that's how you end up being the fastest raising company ever, et cetera, is because you're trying to do this arms race. And that's an old, that goes back to at least the .com era where they were doing the same thing. And this idea that you'd have network monopolies was the form that these businesses would take. And so whatever you're spending to establish that network monopoly, you're going to clean up at the end of the day, and that the markets understand that and will finance that narrative arc, right? That like they know that you can get that, or at least will bet on the odds that you will establish that.
Yeah, and how few do though? It's like, so you'll be the iPod or the Amazon or the eBay or whatever.
Right. There are very few that you can actually point to and say like they did this and then are able to transition that into operating profits that justified their valuation in the first place.
Right.
But then you look at something like Instagram, where Facebook's acquisition of Instagram really saved that company, just period. Like you can look at that Facebook and say like, if they hadn't spent that $1 billion, which way overvalued Instagram, like they would have been fucked. Like they really needed that new platform. Right. So, and I think that justifies it moving forward. Yeah.
Right. They bought a bunch of stuff, but I bought Zynga too, which was a disaster.
No, it's true.
Right. So, but yeah, it could have been the thing that saved them though. You know, you don't know. So, but the hit rate was good enough, at least to get them to where they are at the moment. And the other interesting thing is, I mean, it's a lot of ink or squid ink or whatever gets spilled in a digital age has been spilled on a lot of the Silicon Valley guys taking enough acid or going to Burning Man enough to see the error of their ways. Mm-hmm. So you get the whole, humane technology movement and Roger McNamee and Tristan Harris and the other guys all going, oh, mea culpa, mea culpa. We were so good at doing this and we've got to undo it. And in the Wired piece, the profile that you did of me, there was one clause where you mentioned Social Dilemma and you just said insipid. You said the insipid documentary Social Dilemma. And I wanted to unpack that because I have a hard time explaining why that I feel bad saying that I don't like that movie and what it's about and all, because at least it's helping make people a little bit more media literate about the impact of social media on themselves. But there's something that really bothers me. And I'm wondering if you can articulate, why is it insipid?
So I can make the critique that you can't make as the competitor.
I guess, yeah.
They don't have a structural understanding of capital and class conflict as the conditions for the origin of these kinds of systems. And so if you don't have that kind of understanding, then it doesn't really make sense why people are doing the things that they do, except to say that they're uninformed or making a mistake. And so if people are uninformed or making a mistake about the internet and how the internet works and how social media works, then informing people will allow them to correct that mistake, and the markets will respond and we'll be able to fix the situation. And maybe those efforts themselves are not profitable. Maybe some of them are. Maybe you start your like gray screen app for $1 or something, whatever. Like maybe you can make money off this situation, but maybe it's a nonprofit. Maybe this is a sort of like you're going to embed these market phenomena back in society through some non-market thing, and you can get your tax break for that. And this can be your like activity that's ancillary to whatever tech thing, and the problem can solve itself, right? Because that's what these tech people are saying when they say they want to solve the problems that they've created.
They can write and launch a program that will fix it.
Right. They just need to debug it. They got to update the software for this.
Tune the algorithms for B instead of A,
right,
and then we'll be okay.
And that's wrong, right? And so until you have a deeper understanding of what the problems are, it's hard because also when you tell a capitalist that like, oh no, the problem is capitalism, then they hear like, oh no, the problem is you personally. And they say, well, I don't think the problem is me personally.
I want my house.
Sure, it must be something else. They're right insofar as it is not them personally. Like the problem with capitalism is not a personnel issue, right? It's not like that the capitalists are bad as people, and that if we replace them with other people, we would be in a better situation.
Right. Or at least it's not just that they're bad.
Yeah, some people of them are certainly bad.
Yeah.
But when people say like, oh no, like I'm a good guy and I have good intentions. And so your critiques don't apply to me because I'm not like Elon Musk, or I'm not like those bad capitalists. I want good things for society. I'm not just concerned for myself. And that's not the point, right? And so you can say, like, that's not actually the response. So, like, that's not when you say that and you say, like, oh, I'm trying to do something about this, actually. My intentions are different and my focus is different than the people that you're talking about. That's not actually an answer to the problem. And so I'm still waiting for the rich tech person who's going to say, like, I understand that this system is fucked, and I understand, and I'm listening to the people who are telling me, you know, how this system is fucked, and I've studied it and whatever. And like, this is how I'm going to engage with that, like, struggle to come up with something different. And I think there are ways to do that. I'm excited maybe for people to start trying to find some of them out, but the, like, donate to my nonprofit or like respect me because of my nonprofit because I'm different than the other billionaires or whatever is not the way to get there. It's like, we need you. If you want to show leadership, then you need to like learn a little bit more about what you're talking about and not assume that your position as a entrepreneur or a rich person enables you, gives you some position of insight. And so I get approached by a fair number of these kind of like alternative thinking tech people or whatever who set up institutions to support their thought, and they find people who agree with them about like, oh, the way we're going to do it is we have some sort of like co-op blockchain infrastructure, and like this is the way to get out.
We're going to make a blockchain for multiracial democratic collaboration. And
or even like you know, I'm informed by the history of Georgism, and like I've got this idea of here are the 5 things that are wrong with society, and here are the 5 tools we're going to use to fix them or whatever. And it's like, that's idealism, the idea that you can just like think about what's wrong with the world and then think about your programmatic fix without engaging in the history of social struggle and the like current practice of social struggle is not just like arrogant or like interpersonally off-putting or like going to make it hard for you to work with other people, but it's wrong. And like, you're starting from an incorrect place. And it's frustrating for me when I encounter those people and they assume that I should have some kind of like respect for what they're doing or their project based on the fact that they have enough money to do it as a project because it is in line with some very rich person's thinking.
Right.
And that's not where legitimacy comes from in my mind. And that's too bad that we have rich people who want to do those kind of projects and people who enable them, as opposed to saying like, oh, you've got a bunch of money and you want to do something productive. Like, here are some projects that you can support that have no money and that are not going to make you look good at all.
I've done that. I've been at those meetings and I mentioned this one, that one, this one, that one. And they go, well, if they're any good, why haven't I heard of them?
Or even like, there are things that like you're not going to want to take credit for because then people will get mad at you because these are controversial efforts. And so you can't like do a thumbs, and they're not going to like you even just for giving you money. Like they might like you if you like hang out and are cool despite you having a bunch of money, but like just donating is not going to make them think you're cool or think your ideas are right. And like, you got to read the books like everybody else.
Right.
Yeah. I don't like, at the same time, I don't want to be like, if you happen to be the guy who, I read like the New Yorker article about the guy who started Duolingo. Yeah. He sounds like a fine guy, right? He's like, I invented CAPTCHA as an academic because it was a cool answer to this interesting problem. And then that like accidentally made me like a super duper rich guy. And then I sort of like did that same thing where I was like, it would be cool to have a program about learning languages. And then again, that made me like a super duper rich guy. But like, I have positive intentions towards the world. It's like totally believable. I can absolutely see how that could happen to a person. And I don't think then like, because your class position is now capitalist, that you are evil and like some mask falls on your face and your intentions towards the world become sinister. At the same time, like, you got to be aware of the like your social context and how your like resources are being channeled into flattering yourself. And so you still have to like try to think objectively about society and your role in it, even at the same time as you know that like you're not a bad guy or whatever.
Yeah. I know. And I was thinking there's got to be a way, you go to Burning Man and sit with them in their ayahuasca circle. And there's like, we could give them a different kind of counseling. So they re-enter, understanding that. It's tricky. But before we go, I know we're like on an hour here. I know about Palantir and Peter Thiel, or Thiel, whatever. And, how he made this big, it's basically like a version of Axiom or Claritas, but it's data on everything and everyone for kind of defense-y, security, scary, anti-terror surveillance ways. I mean, I knew about that, but I hadn't really understood sort of how the constellation, I don't know if you can explain it, of Peter Thiel and like Michael Flynn and then Curtis Yarvin, and how does this all kind of fit together? It's like, it's easy to say, oh, Thiel's a vampire fascist, but
right.
He may be a vampire fascist.
Well, yeah. I think he's still figuring it out. I mean, I don't know. He should read this book and learn about Herbert Hoover and like think about what his place is in history. Because I think he doesn't have a great sense of it necessarily. But he is, I think, unlike a lot of his peers, he does have a sense of history as something that exists outside of him.
Right. And he reads philosophy. I mean, he's trying to understand, and he's trying to be essentially a good Girardian Catholic.
Yeah, I mean, it's like it really comes down to like, I think he actually believes that the world exists outside of himself, whereas some of these other like tech people really do believe that the entire world is a projection of their own consciousness.
Right.
And someone like Elon Musk just like straight up does not believe that the rest of the world exists, and that's how he operates, which allows you to do things like straight up gamble with tens of billions of dollars from the Saudi royal family and then like wake up and do it again, which like I would not do. And someone like Thiel is much more like plays the same game, but does it much, much more cautiously. And he's constantly hedging. And I think it's very interesting that he has for a while now looked to the federal government and the security services as a source of growth and as clients for his businesses, which I think is smart and shows the direction of the tech industry. And it shows his knowledge of the tech industry a little bit more than everyone else's, that it's not just about advertising technology and scams or whatever, but that there's a geopolitical historical project here that is about America and the West and Anglo-American eugenics that he's very invested in, like literally and figuratively. And so I talk a little bit about what that network looks like, what his financial network and political network and business network looks like. But there are a lot of unknowns. It's deeper than we think it to be at any given point. But if you look at like lots of small magazines that have popped up and stuff, it's a joke that, oh, Peter Thiel is funding this or Peter Thiel is funding that. But like Peter Thiel is funding a lot of things in the same way that sort of joke that like George Soros is funding this, George Soros is funding that. But then like some people really do get checks from George Soros. And like if you work for the public defender's office in a bunch of states, for example, you get like a Soros bonus that comes from donations from George Soros. Like those things are real. Like the Thiel money is also real. It's a real thing that's happening. And does not have an equivalent on the left. You do not have the same sort of entrepreneurs who are saying, I'm going to invest in a future world, a particular valence of the future world. I'm going to like throw my hat over the wall and saying like, this is what's going to happen. And I'm going to use finance and my resources to bridge that history. But the history that he's bridging us to, the future that he's bridging us to, is a really fucking scary one. So people should keep their eyes open. And when a big turning point in the book, and I think a turning point for the industry, more than any AI bullshit, crypto, Web3, whatever, is the meeting Thiel sets up with the other executives and Donald Trump, where he gets everybody in a circle, meets with Trump, and then suddenly all these companies are applying for prime military contracts in a way that they never have before after meeting with Trump. And they are continuing to do so into the Biden administration. And that represents a real change for an industry that had been subcontractors the whole time for 100 years almost. So people should keep their eyes on that Tealverse. It is a joke, but it's not just a joke. There's really something there.
Right. I mean, well, there's the jokey part, which seems jokey with like the Urbit and, you know, funding all these weird little occult projects and kind of slightly alt-right, bizarre, cultural, anti-woke things. There's that. But I was kind of surprised. I guess I had always thought of Michael Flynn as just some kind of military idiot dude who got in trouble with Trump and all. But when you see that he was actually, you know, deeply involved in Palantir.
Yeah, well, he's an Obama appointee first, remember? It's Obama who promoted him.
And Obama was the most techno-solutionist president that we had, you know, a technocratic dude. But then Obama was scared enough of Flynn to the one thing he told Trump was, watch out for this dude. You know,
not just Flynn, but Flynn is one of the members of the military command that Palantir is able to cultivate personally and say, like, you know, become familiar with our technology, get used to it, get dependent on it, promote it as you advance through the ranks. And this has been a somewhat successful strategy. We'll see how long. Palantir is one of those tech companies that could go either way. Either it's like a very functional and scary military spy tool, or it's a scam. And it's not clear sort of like which side of the line it falls on right now. They might still not know, right? That's also Oracle. That was also Theranos. You know, that's it's a good way to make money. So Palantir, but like Anduril also exists, which is his physical. They make that he's invested. That Thiel's also invested in, that makes physical defense solutions. That makes towers and walls and drones and shit.
Right, but I mean, you had a version of the what's it called? Rocco's Basilisk, you know, which is the famous thing, like basically be nice to AIs now, because when they're in charge, they're going to kill you if you are not nice to them now.
And they are probably already in charge. And this is probably just a simulation to see if you would be nice to them.
Right. And if you're not, they're going to torture you forever, which seems stupid. If I was not, I'd just kill you, you know. But anyway, they'll torture you forever. But then there was a version of this that someone posted on Reddit. It's like that Palantir is that.
Yeah. Thiel in particular is the basilisk, and that you have to invest all your money in Thiel.
Right. Now, while I'm sure you don't believe in that as our probable future or as a strategy for survival in the coming decades, I am wondering, after having kind of studied and chronicled this big sweep of history, I mean, I find the best things about doing history for me, one of them is it kind of puts a present moment in a perspective. I mean, do you feel like we're moving into some kind of actual critical event? Like, are we over the event horizon into some chaotic, strange attractor? Or are we kind of just reverting to the mean, that this is the way civilization has always been?
Unlike David Graeber, I don't have a like 5,000-year historical arc in my head, and so I couldn't give you the full those size cycles. I like limit my understanding of history to the last 200 years, right? Where I've actually studied it. So within that, I think we see both like cyclical and univocal tendencies. So you definitely see cycles in terms of how we perceive the like tech leadership, and maybe those cycles are going faster and faster, right? Where like the bubble pops and reinflates very, very quickly. And I think we've seen that with like crypto and AI, for example, right? Where the bubble pops and then immediately we have to have a new bubble as soon as that one's gone, or else the economy will break down. And so we have to have like a new magic story immediately. And you can even just like copy and paste the old story into the new story. In fact, the new machine will do that for you. You could have the ChatGPT explain why it replaces Web3 or whatever. So that's definitely a like cyclical bubble machine or whatever. But no, I think we do see we're moving towards some real limits. not just economically, but ecologically. And that has to do with these things getting sillier, or the things getting sillier has to do with that, right? And I think that's the reason you saw the Silicon Valley Bank run, is that the bank is now, finance's job is to produce the profits, not just direct the investment into profitable areas like airplanes or radio or agricultural land or whatever, but to actually generate the profits itself. And so that means it can't play this important role, which is to coordinate that investment and absorb risk for the milieu, and instead creates that risk. So we'll see. It's interesting. We're definitely heading towards something, moments of crisis and conflict. And I think the philosophically minded techno-capitalists think that as well. And so you see all sorts of crazy rhetoric from them, and the like open right-wing rhetoric from people like Musk. But even more important than Musk is, I think Larry Ellison is like way scarier than Musk. That like Elon Musk is kind of frivolous, but like Larry Ellison is a top 10 rich people who's been a CIA contractor for 40 plus years and is now talking about election denialism and like seems to have gone all the way. So that scares me as much as Tio, as much as anyone, is Larry Ellison for sure.
Right. Because they must, I mean, because he's not an idiot, right? So he doesn't actually believe in the election denialism, but he must believe that some sort of authoritarian leadership has to be put in place for him to maintain his empire.
Yeah. I think like philosophically, these people have moved off the idea of democracy, which is, concerning. It's not, I don't think they had a deep commitment to equality of all peoples or anything, or like economic democracy for the world before that.
Right.
But now they are dropping the sort of liberal veil to like talking about, and when you talk to these people, privately or whatever, the like conversations they have, they're fully round the bend, a lot of them, about Francoism or, whatever. They're fash curious, at least, very commonly now, I think, in San Francisco and those milieus.
They, like us, are seeing what happens when a system is accelerated at scale. That basically, as you would put it, like a scraping technology working at scale. So they see the here comes everybody of digitally enabled democracy as a threat to everything. And we see the threat of digitally scaled capitalism as, all right, capitalism kind of was maybe okay when it was kept in check as one of a few systems, but now it's like, it's just going to run amok. So I think they're as shocked at our rejection of what they think of as the American way as we are of their rejection of what we think of as basic Enlightenment humanist values.
Yeah, well, and some of them are, there's a whole philosophical strand of progressivists who are so committed to the progressive account of the 20th century that they refuse to believe that things could possibly be getting worse. And so I think any ways that things are getting worse are, just mere errors in the code that we can correct, but that actually things must be getting better because we're accumulating growth. And how could things not be getting better? That's the definition of things getting better. So there's a lot up in the air right now, and we're going to have to do a better job, those of us on the far left, of being strategic about how we compete in this world of ideas.
Compete. It's back to competition.
Well,
so I guess the idea is we'll find the best idea at the earliest possible stage, and then
we just got to find some young kids from Palo Alto. And no,
right, and send out 1,000. If we lose 50, whatever. It's a price of doing business.
Young bloggers, right? This is the blogosphere solution. No, probably won't be able to do that. We'll have to actually build some kind of community structures intentionally.
Yeah.
Dang.
Well, that's what Team Human is for.
It's okay.
Right?
It'll be fun. We're gonna win. I'm trying to like adopt a happy warrior orientation towards the struggles of the near future.
That's what I started to do in like 2015, 16. I was like, that's when I went Team Human. It's all gonna be okay.
Let's go.
Get rapport, solidarity. It's gonna be fun. Hold hands. And it's all, I mean, if it's going to work, that's what it's going to be. So we may as well.
That's what I think. Yeah. And so we know what the answer is. So let's start answering. Anyway, that's the next project. Thank you. I'll have to come back.
Okay. Definitely. All right. Well, thank you. Thanks so much for what you do. It's important. You know, you do work harder than I do. You bring you do. You're more rigorous. You work differently. You bring a rigor to this that is, you know, both refreshing and comforting. It gives people like me ground to stand on, you know, because I don't feel like I'm just pondering. I feel like, oh, this is, you went and did the work. You went and did the 600 pages of whatever, of work. And it's like, well, thank God. I mean, there's someone young enough. You're still younger, you know, you've got 30 years on me.
That Palo Alto system is good for, right?
It is, though. No, but you have an endurance that, because otherwise I would just be out over the fucking edge of the cliff just talking. So thank you for that. And bring some hope into this. You know, you can look into the abyss of history and future and still emerge with hope and a plan for success through solidarity. And that's good to know.
Well, thank you much for having me, for giving a platform to chat with your listeners. I hope they find something in there useful.
All right, definitely. All right, thank you. Thank you, Malcolm. Thanks for everything.
Thanks, Douglas.
And thank you for being on Team Human. Our guest today was Malcom Harris, author of Palo Alto, A History of California, Capitalism, and the World. You can find it in all forms wherever books are sold or loaned. Team Human was produced by Joshua Chapdelaine and edited by Luke Robert Mason. I'm Douglas Rushkoff, and you've been on Team Human, our last best hope for peeps.